Welcome to Alien Whispers. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Now, let's dive into the story. The twin suns of Syrion blazed down like twin furnaces, their relentless heat turning the desert into a furnace of sand and suffering. Twisted metal from shattered ships jutted from the dunes like the bones of some ancient beast, while the charred remains of soldiers and machines lay scattered like offerings to a cruel god. In the distance, the faint rumble of plasma cannons echoed, a grim reminder that this planet was still a battlefield, even if the front lines had shifted elsewhere. Captain Jackson Thorn wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the horizon through the cracked visor of his helmet. His reconnaissance team moved cautiously through the dunes, their footsteps muffled by the shifting sand. They were deep in Valthorian territory, tasked with gathering intel on enemy movements, a mission that had already cost them too much. Jackson's gut churned with unease. Something about this place felt wrong, like they were being watched. "Stay sharp," he muttered into his comms, his voice barely audible over the static. "We're sitting ducks out here." No sooner had the words left his lips than the air erupted in chaos. Energy beams sliced through the sky, their searing light blinding in the midday glare. Jackson's heart leapt into his throat as Valthorian soldiers materialized from behind the dunes, their silver armor glinting like liquid metal under the suns. The ambush was swift and brutal. "Take cover," Jackson shouted, but his warning came too late. His team scattered, seeking refuge behind rocks and wreckage, but the Valthorians were already upon them. Plasma bolts tore through the air, sizzling as they found their marks. Private Ellis screamed as a bolt grazed his arm, and Sergeant Ramirez dragged him behind a boulder, her face grim with determination. Tenor wasn't so lucky. A Valthorian sniper's shot caught him square in the chest, silencing him forever. Jackson's stomach twisted with grief, but there was no time to mourn. He raised his pulse rifle and fired back, the weapon's recoil jarring his shoulder. He took down one Valthorian, then another, but for every enemy that fell, two more seemed to take their place. The battle was a blur of noise and motion. Energy beams crisscrossing like lightning, screams piercing the air, the acrid stench of burning ozone filling his lungs. Jackson fought with everything he had, his training kicking in as he moved from cover to cover. But the Valthorians were relentless, their movements coordinated and precise, like a well-oiled machine. A sharp pain ripped through his side, and Jackson staggered. He looked down to see a plasma bolt had pierced his armor, leaving a smoking hole in its wake. Blood seeped from the wound, soaking his uniform and turning the sand beneath him into a dark, sticky paste. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might black out. "Captain!" Ramirez's voice crackled through his comms, but it was distant, like an echo from another world. "We need to fall back." "There's nowhere to fall back to," Jackson muttered, his voice barely audible even to himself. His team was decimated, his body was failing him, and the enemy was closing in. He was alone. With a final surge of adrenaline, Jackson dove behind the wreckage of a scout ship, its hull torn open like a gutted animal. The metal was still warm from the battle, and the smell of burned circuitry and fuel stung his nose. He crawled inside, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. His helmet was cracked, the comms unit sparking uselessly. He was cut off, isolated, and utterly alone. Outside, the sounds of the patrol grew louder. Boots crunched on sand, voices barked orders in a language he couldn't understand. They were searching for survivors, and Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. He pressed himself deeper into the wreckage, his breathing ragged and uneven. His hand instinctively went to his holster, but it was empty. His weapon had been lost in the ambush. Sweat trickled into his eyes, stinging, as he tried to steady his breathing. The footsteps drew closer, and a shadow fell across the opening of his hiding place. This was it. He was surrounded, unarmed, and exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was fading, leaving only pain and the certainty of capture, or worse. He closed his eyes, preparing himself for the end. The faces of his fallen comrades flashed through his mind. Ramirez with her quick laugh, Tenor who'd been counting down the days until retirement, young Ellis who'd never seen combat before this mission. They were gone, and it was his fault. His thoughts drifted to his sister, Lena, back on Earth. She had always been the dreamer, talking about peace and unity between the stars, while he had chosen the path of a soldier. "You're fighting for the wrong side," she had said before he left. Now, as he faced death, he wondered if she had been right all along. How many civilians had died because of his actions? How many families had been torn apart? Regret washed over him, but it was too late for atonement. He was going to die here, alone and forgotten. "This is it, isn't it?" he whispered to himself. "No one's coming." Then, a sound, a soft footstep, not like the heavy boots of the Valthorians. He opened his eyes and saw her, a woman with silver skin that shimmered like polished metal, emerging from the deeper shadows of the wreckage. Her features were sharp and alien, her eyes solid black, without pupil or iris, locking onto his with an intensity that made him shiver. She wore torn armor, pieced together from scavenged parts, and a heavy sword was strapped to her back, its blade seeming to drink in the light. "Get up, weakling," she said, her voice low and harsh, cutting through the haze of his pain. "Only fools die here." Jackson Thorn lay crumpled in the wreckage of the scout ship, his side burning from the plasma wound that had torn through his armor. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of scorched metal and fuel, and the relentless heat of Syrion's twin suns pressed down like a suffocating blanket. Outside, the Valthorian patrols were closing in, their boots grinding against the sand, their voices sharp and guttural as they barked orders in an alien tongue. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. He was trapped, unarmed, and fading fast. The end was near. A shadow loomed across the jagged opening of his hiding place, and Jackson braced himself for capture or death. His cracked helmet sparked uselessly, cutting him off from any hope of rescue. He closed his eyes, the weight of his failures crashing over him. Ramirez, Tenor, Ellis, they were gone, and he had led them to their deaths. His sister's words echoed in his mind. "You're fighting for the wrong side." Maybe she had been right. Then, a sound, not the heavy tread of Valthorian boots, but a soft, deliberate step. Jackson's eyes snapped open, and he saw her, a woman with silver skin that gleamed faintly in the dim light filtering through the wreckage. Her features were sharp, almost predatory, and her eyes were solid black, like twin voids that seemed to see straight through him. She wore patchwork armor, cobbled together from scavenged parts, and a heavy sword was strapped to her back, its blade dark and menacing. "Get up, human," she said, her voice low and cutting. "Only the weak die here." Jackson stared, his pain-fogged mind struggling to place her. Then it hit him. He had seen her before, in the IDF detention camp, a Valthorian prisoner who stood apart from the others, silent and unyielding. She had been marked for interrogation, but now she was here, free, and inexplicably saving him. "Why save me?" he rasped, his throat parched and raw. "I'm your enemy." She knelt beside him, her black eyes unyielding. "You're my way out. Move, or I'll leave you behind." Her words were cold, her tone leaving no room for debate. With a strength that belied her lean frame, she hauled him to his feet. Pain exploded through his side, and he stifled a groan. She slipped her shoulder under his arm, supporting his weight as they staggered toward a narrow gap in the wreckage she had emerged from. Behind them, the patrol's voices grew louder, their footsteps echoing in the hollow shell of the ship. They squeezed through the opening into a maintenance shaft, the air cool and musty, a stark contrast to the searing heat outside. Zara'el moved with the confidence of a predator, her steps silent and sure, guiding Jackson through the darkness. The tunnel was cramped, its walls lined with rusted pipes and frayed cables that snagged at his torn uniform. Jackson stumbled, his legs threatening to give out, but her grip was iron, keeping him upright. They emerged into the blinding light of the desert, the twin suns blazing overhead. The landscape was a sea of sand, dotted with the twisted remains of ships and vehicles, their metal skeletons glinting like bones under the harsh light. In the distance, the faint shimmer of heat rose from the dunes, distorting the horizon. "We need to move," Zara'el said, her voice urgent but controlled. "They'll be searching for us." Jackson nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain. They set off across the sand, keeping low to avoid detection. Every step was torture, the wound in his side pulsing with each movement. Zara'el moved ahead, her posture alert, her eyes scanning the terrain for threats. Her sword, still sheathed, was their only defense, and Jackson had no doubt she could wield it with deadly precision. As they trudged through the desert, Jackson stole glances at her. Her silver skin seemed to reflect the sunlight, making her almost ethereal in the harsh glare. Her armor was a patchwork of scavenged pieces, reinforced with metal and ceramic, tied with sinew. A pendant of dark metal hung around her neck, engraved with unfamiliar symbols. Her fingers brushed it occasionally, a subtle gesture that hinted at its significance. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the dry air. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Zara'el," she said at last, her tone clipped. "That's all you need to know." "I'm Jackson," he offered, though he wasn't sure why. "Jackson Thorn." "I know," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of amusement. "Now save your breath. We got a long way to go." They continued in silence, the only sounds the crunch of sand under their feet and the distant howl of the wind. The heat was relentless, sapping Jackson's strength, but Zara'el seemed unfazed, her pace steady and purposeful. He marveled at her resilience, wondering how she could thrive in such a hostile environment. After hours of grueling travel, they paused in the shadow of a rock formation. Zara'el handed him a canteen, and he drank sparingly, the water warm but precious. She took a small sip herself, her movements economical. "Why not leave me?" Jackson asked, handing back the canteen. "You could have found another way." She fixed him with a piercing stare. "You know this territory. That makes you useful." For now, Jackson sensed there was more to her decision, but he didn't press. Instead, he looked out at the vast desert, its endless dunes stretching into the distance. "Where are we headed?" "Haven 9, she said. "A neutral spaceport. 3 days east, if we're lucky." 3 days in this hellscape seemed impossible, but Jackson had no choice. As they prepared to move on, a low rumble filled the air, growing louder by the second. He looked up to see a massive cloud of sand rising in the distance, swirling and churning like a living beast. "What is that?" he asked, fear creeping into his voice. Zara'el's expression hardened. "A sandstorm, and it's coming for us." The twin suns of Syrion blazed overhead, their searing light turning the desert into a crucible of sand and suffering. Jackson Thorn trudged forward, each step a battle against the relentless heat and the throbbing pain in his side from the plasma wound. His uniform was caked with dust, his lips cracked from dehydration, but he pressed on, driven by the will to survive. Beside him, Zara'el moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the harsh environment. Her silver skin shimmered under the suns, and her black eyes scanned the horizon with a predator's vigilance. She was a Valthorian warrior, an enigma who had saved him for reasons he still didn't fully understand. Their destination was Haven 9, a neutral spaceport 2 days away across the unforgiving desert. 2 days in this hellscape felt like a lifetime, with water scarce and dangers lurking behind every dune. Jackson's throat burned, but he knew better than to ask for a drink. Zara'el had been clear. Their supplies were limited, and survival depended on discipline. As they crested a dune, Jackson spotted a cluster of jagged rocks in the distance, their surfaces etched with the scars of countless sandstorms. "What are those?" he asked, his voice rough from the dry air. "Ruins," Zara'el replied, her tone clipped. "From a time before the war. We'll rest there." Jackson nodded, too exhausted to press for details. They made their way toward the ruins, the sand shifting beneath their boots like a living thing. Up close, the rocks revealed themselves as remnants of an ancient structure, their walls adorned with faded carvings of strange, spiraling symbols. The sight stirred a flicker of curiosity in Jackson, but his body demanded rest more than answers. Zara'el led them to a shaded alcove, where the air was marginally cooler. She sat cross-legged, pulling a small pouch from her pack, and took a measured sip from her canteen. Without a word, she offered it to Jackson. He hesitated, aware of how precious water was, then accepted, taking a small sip. The liquid was warm and metallic, but it felt like salvation. "Thanks," he said, handing it back. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "We move again soon. Haven 9 is still 2 days out." Jackson's gaze drifted to her arms, where intricate tattoos glowed faintly, their patterns shifting like liquid light. They were unlike anything he had seen, a tapestry of symbols that seemed alive. "Those tattoos, they tell a story, don't they?" Zara'el's eyes narrowed, a flicker of wariness crossing her face. "A story you wouldn't understand. Keep walking." But Jackson's curiosity got the better of him. "What do they mean? Are they symbols of your clan?" She paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "They're records of my people's history, our victories, our losses. Each mark is a life, a battle, a memory." Jackson leaned forward, intrigued. "So, they're like a living history?" "Something like that," she said, her tone softening slightly. "They remind me who I am, what I've lost." Her words hit Jackson harder than he expected. He thought of his own past, the civilians he couldn't save, the orders he had followed without question. "I wish I had something like that," he murmured. "Something to remind me why I'm still here." Zara'el's black eyes met his, sharp and searching. "You're here to survive, same as me. That's enough for now." They fell silent, the only sound the faint whistle of wind through the ruins. The heat was oppressive, the air shimmering with mirages that danced across the dunes. Jackson's body ached, his wound a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. Yet Zara'el seemed unfazed, her movements precise and economical, as if the desert were her natural domain. As the suns began their slow descent, casting long shadows across the sand, they resumed their trek. The ruins faded behind them, replaced by endless dunes that stretched into the distance. Jackson's legs felt like lead, but he matched Zara'el's pace, determined not to slow her down. She moved ahead, her posture alert, her sword still sheathed but ready. He marveled at her resilience, wondering what kind of life had forged such a warrior. They paused again near a crumbling pillar, its surface etched with more of those ancient symbols. Zara'el checked their bearings, her fingers brushing the pendant at her neck, a dark metal disc engraved with unfamiliar runes. Jackson watched, sensing its importance but knowing better than to ask. "How do you do it?" he said instead. "Survive out here like it's nothing?" She glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "It's not nothing. It's training, instinct, and necessity. You'd learn if you had to." Jackson managed a weak smile. "Maybe, but I'm glad you're here to show me." For a moment, her smirk softened into something almost warm, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Don't get used to it," she said, turning away. "You're still a liability." They continued on, the desert growing darker as the suns dipped lower. The air cooled slightly, but the sand retained the day's heat, radiating it back like a furnace. Jackson's vision blurred from fatigue, but he kept his eyes on Zara'el's back, using her steady pace as an anchor. Suddenly, she stopped, her body tensing like a coiled spring. Her hand hovered near her sword, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. "What is it?" Jackson whispered, his heart pounding. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the dunes. "Something's out there," she said finally, her voice low and urgent. "We're not alone." Jackson strained to see or hear anything, but the desert was silent, its vastness swallowing all sound. Yet the hairs on his neck stood on end, a primal instinct warning him of danger. "What do we do?" "Stay close," Zara'el said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. and be ready to run. The desert of Syrion stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of shifting sands dotted with the skeletal remains of war. Twisted metal, shattered vehicles, and the faint shimmer of heat rising from the dunes. Jackson Thorn limped alongside Zara'el, his side still aching from the plasma wound, but his determination to reach Haven 9 kept him moving. Zara'el, with her silver skin and black eyes, moved with a predator's grace, her every step deliberate and sure. As they descended into a valley between dunes, Zara'el suddenly stopped, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. "Wait," she said, her voice low and urgent. Jackson froze, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "Mines," she replied, her eyes scanning the ground ahead. "Old ones from the first wave of the invasion." Jackson looked down, seeing nothing but sand. "How can you tell?" "My people have ways," she said cryptically. "Stay close, and step only where I step." They proceeded with caution, Zara'el leading the way, her feet barely disturbing the sand. Jackson followed, his eyes fixed on her footprints, trying to place his boots exactly where hers had been. The tension was palpable, each step a potential trigger for disaster. The air was thick with heat, and the silence of the desert seemed to amplify every sound. Their breathing, the faint crunch of sand beneath their boots. Despite his best efforts, Jackson's foot slipped slightly, brushing against a patch of sand that looked no different from the rest. A soft click echoed through the air, and before he could react, the ground erupted in a plume of sand and fire. The explosion threw him backward, pain exploding in his leg as something snapped. He landed hard, the world spinning around him. When his vision cleared, he saw Zara'el standing over him, her face a mask of concern. "You fool," she muttered, but there was no anger in her voice, only worry. "My leg," Jackson gasped, looking down to see his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. "It's broken." Zara'el knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she examined the injury. "We need to get you to shelter," she said. "There's an old outpost nearby. Can you move?" Jackson shook his head, pain making it hard to think. "I don't think so." Without another word, Zara'el lifted him, her strength surprising him once again. She carried him across the sand, her steps sure and steady, even with his added weight. They reached the outpost, a crumbling structure half buried in the sand, its walls pockmarked with blaster scars. Inside, the air was cool and musty, a stark contrast to the heat outside. Zara'el set him down gently, then began rummaging through her pack. She pulled out a small vial containing a glowing, blue substance. "This is Valthorian salve," she explained. "It will help with the pain and speed healing." She applied the salve to his leg, the cool liquid soothing the fire in his muscles. Jackson watched her, amazed at her care. "You didn't have to save me again," he groaned, his voice weak. Zara'el met his gaze, her black eyes unreadable. "A dead guide is useless," she said. "Don't make me regret it." But Jackson sensed there was more to it. "Is that all?" She hesitated, then said, "You're not like the others. You have honor." Jackson was taken aback. "Honor? After everything I've done?" "Perhaps," she said, standing up. "Rest now. We'll need to move soon." As she turned away, a low growl echoed from the darkness beyond the outpost's walls. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. What was that? Zara'el's hand went to her sword, her body tensing. "Something that shouldn't be here," she whispered. "We're not alone." The sky above Syrion darkened ominously, the twin suns obscured by a massive wall of sand that churned and roiled like a living thing. Jackson Thorn, his legs still throbbing from the recent break, leaned heavily on Zara'el as they pushed forward through the increasingly fierce winds. The air was thick with sand, stinging their skin and making it hard to breathe. "We need to find shelter," Jackson shouted over the howling wind. Zara'el nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "There's a ridge ahead. If we can reach it, we might find a cave or something to ride out the storm." They struggled against the wind, each step a battle. The sandstorm grew stronger, reducing visibility to mere feet. Jackson could barely see Zara'el beside him, her silver skin now dulled by the sand that clung to her. Suddenly, a gust of wind stronger than the rest hit them, knocking Jackson off his feet. He tumbled down a slope, his injured leg screaming in protest as he slid uncontrollably. He came to a stop in a narrow crevice, the walls closing in around him, trapping him in darkness. "Zara'el," he called, but the wind swallowed his voice. Panic set in as he realized he was alone, buried under tons of sand with no way out. His leg was agony, and he feared it might be broken again. He tried to move, but the pain was too much, and the sand shifted, threatening to bury him completely. Then, through the haze of pain and fear, he heard a voice. Jackson! It was Zara'el. She was alive, and she was looking for him. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The storm was still raging, and he was still trapped. "Jackson, where are you?" Her voice was closer now, but still distant. "Here!" he shouted, hoping she could hear him over the wind. A few moments later, her face appeared above him, her black eyes wide with concern. "Hold on," she said, reaching down to grab his arm. With surprising strength, she pulled him up out of the crevice. The storm had abated slightly, enough for them to see each other clearly. Jackson's leg gave out as soon as he stood, and he collapsed against her. "We need to splint that leg," she said, helping him to sit down. Using pieces of debris from the storm, she fashioned a makeshift splint, her hands steady and sure. As she worked, Jackson watched her, marveling at her resilience. "Why did you come back for me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She didn't look up from her task. "You're my responsibility now," she said. "I can't leave you behind." "But why?" he pressed. "I'm just a human, your enemy." She finished tightening the splint and finally met his gaze. "My people were lost because of yours," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Yet I still saved you." Jackson was silent, processing her words. He had never thought of it that way. He had always seen himself as a soldier doing his duty. But now, hearing her perspective, he realized how much he had been complicit in the suffering of others. "I'm not them," he said finally. "I'm just me." She nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Rest now. The storm will pass, and we'll continue." But as they sat there, waiting for the storm to subside, Jackson noticed Zara'el's gaze fixed on the horizon, her body tense. "What is it?" he asked. "Something's out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something dangerous." Jackson followed her gaze, but saw nothing but sand and sky. Yet he trusted her instincts. Whatever it was coming for them. The twin suns of Syrion dipped low, casting jagged shadows across the rocky canyon. Jackson Thorn limped alongside Zara'el, his legs still tender from the break, but bolstered by Valthorian salve. The air was thick with the scent of dust and metal, and the silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crunch of sand under their boots. The canyon's high walls loomed on either side, a natural choke point that made Jackson's instincts scream danger. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered, gripping his scavenged IDF pulse rifle tighter. Zara'el's black eyes flicked toward him, her posture alert. "You sense it too?" Before he could respond, a figure emerged from behind a boulder, clad in mismatched armor with a red bandana tied around his arm. Well, look what we have here," the man said, his voice a gravelly sneer. "A human and a Valthorian, together. That's a rare prize." More figures materialized from the shadows, 6 in total, their weapons a mix of blasters, vibroblades, and crude projectile guns. Their leader, a burly man with a scar slicing down his face, stepped forward, his grin revealing yellowed teeth. "You're worth a fortune. The IDF wants their deserter back, and the Valthorians pay well for their kind." Zara'el's hand rested on her energy sword, her stance shifting to one of lethal readiness. "You won't collect," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. The leader laughed, a harsh bark. 6 against 2? Even a Valthorian can't beat those odds. Jackson's mind raced. His leg limited his mobility, but he couldn't let them be taken. He scanned the canyon, noting boulders and debris that could serve as cover. "Zara'el," he whispered, "I'll draw their fire. You take them out." She gave a subtle nod, her eyes never leaving the mercenaries. Jackson stepped forward, raising his hands as if surrendering. "Wait, let's talk. Maybe we can make a deal." The leader smirked. "What could you offer?" In a flash, Jackson dove behind a boulder, firing his pulse rifle wildly to sow chaos. Plasma bolts slammed into the rock, sending shards flying. Zara'el sprang into action, her sword igniting in a blaze of silver light. She closed on the nearest mercenary, disarming him with a flick of her blade before slicing through his chest in a single, fluid motion. Another mercenary swung his vibroblade at her, but Zara'el's Nagwai cam senses flared, alerting her to his move. She spun, parrying the attack and countering with a kick that sent him sprawling. Jackson, from his cover, fired a precise shot, dropping a second mercenary before he could aim his blaster. 2 down, 4 to go. Zara'el engaged a third, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. Her movements were a dance of deadly precision, each strike forcing her opponent back. Jackson, meanwhile, spotted a sniper on a ledge above, his scope trained on Zara'el. Heart pounding, he grabbed a jagged rock and hurled it, striking the sniper's helmet. The man staggered, his shot going wide, missing Zara'el by inches. She glanced back, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, then returned to her duel. Jackson scrambled to another boulder, his leg protesting with every move. 2 mercenaries advanced on him, their blasters firing. He waited, timing their approach, then rolled out, shooting one in the chest. The other lunged with a vibroblade, and Jackson barely dodged, the blade grazing his arm, drawing blood. He threw sand in the mercenary's face, blinding him, then tackled him to the ground, knocking him out with a blow from his rifles, but Zara'el, now facing the leader, clashed swords in a blaze of energy. The Scar Man was strong, his strikes heavy, but Zara'el was faster. She ducked under a swing, her blade slicing his arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. Jackson, seeing an opening, fired at the leader's leg, staggering him. Zara'el finished the fight with a clean thrust through his heart. The remaining mercenary, a woman with a cybernetic arm, hesitated, then fled into the desert, her red bandana trailing behind. Jackson and Zara'el stood amidst the bodies, breathing heavily. Blood trickled from the gash on Jackson's arm, and Zara'el noticed. "Let me see that," she said, pulling antiseptic from their scavenged supplies. She cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced ease. "You need to be more careful," she said, her tone stern but laced with concern. Jackson managed a weak smile. "I'll try, but it's hard when you're doing all the heavy lifting." She smirked. "You did your part. We make a good team." "Nice moves," Jackson said, catching his breath. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" "Survival," Zara'el replied, her eyes glinting. "You're not bad yourself, human." They searched the bodies, collecting a communicator, medical supplies, and energy cells. Jackson activated the communicator, and it crackled to life. A voice hissed through static. "Confirmed, there's a traitor among them. Proceed with caution. The bounty is still active." Jackson frowned. "A traitor? Among who?" "Us." Zara'el shook her head. "Perhaps the mercenaries, or in the IDF or Valthorian ranks. It's unclear. Either way, it means trouble," Jackson said, pocketing the device. They gathered their spoils and moved on, their steps more synchronized, their alliance stronger than ever. But the cryptic message lingered, a shadow of doubt trailing them through the desert. The night air of Syrion was cold, a stark contrast to the day's searing heat. Jackson Thorn and Zara'el found refuge in a small cave carved into a cliffside, its walls shielding them from the biting desert wind. They built a modest fire with dry brush, its flickering light casting shadows across the rough stone. Jackson's body ached from the mercenary fight, but the victory and their growing partnership gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. They sat across from each other, eating rations scavenged from the Crimson Reavers, tasteless nutrient bars that filled the stomach but did little else. Jackson broke the silence, his voice soft as he stared into the flames. "You know, I never wanted this life. I joined the IDF thinking I could protect people, make a difference. But all I've done is add to the suffering." Zara'el's black eyes met his, her expression softening. Va twists intentions. It turns good into bad, hope into despair. He nodded. The weight of his choice is heavy. My sister, Lena, believed in peace. She'd talk about a world where fighting wasn't the answer, where people could find common ground. I thought she was naive, ignored her. Now, I think she might have been right. And now? Zara'el asked, her voice quiet but probing. Now, it feels too late, Jackson admitted. I've done things I can't undo, orders I followed, lives I couldn't save. Zara'el was silent, her gaze distant as if lost in her own memories. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My people were warriors, but we valued life. We fought to protect our homes, our families. When your forces came, we had no choice but to resist. Jackson leaned forward, sensing the pain behind her words. What happened to your clan? They were wiped out, she said, her voice raw. In the early battles, I was captured, taken to an IDF prison camp. The guards were brutal, beatings, interrogations. I escaped during a raid, but by then, my home was gone, my people's song silent. I'm sorry, Jackson said, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. She shook her head. It's not your fault. You're not responsible for your entire race. But I am for my actions, he countered. I've contributed to this war, to your pain. Zara'el reached into her pack and pulled out a small canteen, its surface etched with Valthorian runes. She unscrewed the cap, took a sip, and offered it to him. In my culture, sharing water is a sacred act. It signifies trust, alliance, a bond that says our fates are intertwined. Jackson accepted the canteen, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. He drank, the cool water a small comfort in the harsh desert. Thank you, he said, returning it. She nodded, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. We're both survivors, Jackson. We've lost much, but together, we might find a path forward. He smiled faintly, warmed by her words. Maybe you're right. The fire crackled, filling the silence with a gentle rhythm. For the first time, Jackson felt a connection beyond survival. A fragile thread of friendship forming in the unforgiving wasteland. Zara'el's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable but soft, hinting at emotions she wasn't ready to voice. Their moment of peace was shattered by a deep, rumbling explosion in the distance. The cave trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Jackson's hand went to his pulse rifle, his heart racing. What was that? He asked, his voice tense. Zara'el's eyes narrowed as she peered into the darkness beyond the cave's mouth. I don't know, but it's not good. They sat alert, the warmth of their shared moment overshadowed by the looming threat of whatever lay outside. The cave's damp walls glistened faintly in the firelight, a stark contrast to Syrion's scorching desert. Jackson Thorn leaned against the cool stone, his body aching from battle survived. Ambushes, sandstorms, mercenaries. Across from him, Zara'el sharpened her energy sword, its blade humming softly. Her silver skin shimmered, and her black eyes, devoid of pupils, seemed to pierce the shadows. Zara'el, Jackson said, his voice rough from thirst. Why keep saving me? The wreckage, the minefield, the storm. You could have walked away. She paused, her gaze meeting his. My people have a tradition, a life debt. When one saves another's life, it forges a sacred bond, a pact of loyalty until the debt is repaid or death severs it. Jackson frowned, grappling with the idea. So, I owe you because you saved me? It's not about debt in your sense, she said, her tone measured. It's about connection. Each life saved deepens the bond. And it's mutual. You saved me from the mercenaries. He blinked, surprised. So, we're both bound to each other? Yes, she said, a faint smile touching her lips. Our fates are intertwined. Jackson leaned back, the weight of her words settling over him. The concept was foreign, yet it stirred something within, a chance to move beyond survival. How do we repay it? By standing together, Zara'el replied, her voice softening. I seek a new purpose with my clan gone. You carry guilt for your past. Perhaps we can help each other find meaning. Her words struck a chord. Jackson had spent years running from the blood on his hands, Civilians lost. Orders blindly followed. I've been lost for a long time, he admitted. Maybe this bond is a way to start over, to do something right. Zara'el reached into her pack, retrieving a dark metal pendant etched with swirling Valthorian runes. This seals our pact, she said, offering it. It marks you as one I trust, as part of my clan. Jackson took the pendant, its warmth surprising him, as if it pulsed with her resolve. He met her gaze, seeing a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Thank you, Zara'el. I'll honor this. He fastened it around his neck, the weight grounding him. For the first time, he felt a purpose beyond mere survival, a commitment to her, to their shared path. This debt binds us, human, Zara'el said, her voice steady but warm, until death or choice frees us. Then I choose to stay, Jackson replied, a half-smile forming. For now, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their pact. But their moment of connection was cut short by a faint rustle outside the cave, like boots on sand. Zara'el's hand tightened on her sword, her body tensing. We're not alone, she whispered, rising swiftly. Jackson grabbed his pulse rifle, heart racing. Who's out there? I don't know, she said, moving to the cave's mouth. But they're hunting us. In the moonlight, shadows shifted, figures creeping closer. Jackson's grip tightened, ready to fight alongside her, their bond now a shield against the unknown. Haven, 9 sprawled across the desert, a chaotic maze of steel towers and neon lights that pulsed against the twilight. Ships roared overhead, their engines shaking the air, while traders hawked wares in a cacophony of alien tongues. The scent of fuel mingled with strange spices and beings of every kind, scaled, feathered, or metallic, jostled through the crowded streets. Jackson Thorn and Zara'el wove through the throng, their dusty armor drawing curious glances but no questions. Haven, 9 was a place where pasts were irrelevant, and survival depended on what you could offer. Jackson's leg ached, but he kept pace with Zara'el, her silver skin catching the neon glow. We need a way off this rock, Zara'el said, her voice low to avoid eavesdroppers. But first, we need to know who's after us. Jackson nodded. There's a comms hub nearby. I can try contacting an IDF channel, but it's risky. Risk is all we have, she replied, her hand resting on her sword. They reached a bustling terminal, its screens flashing with flight schedules and bounty notices. Jackson slipped into a booth, punching in his IDF codes. The screen flickered, then displayed a stark message. Captain Jackson Thorn, deserter. Surrender for court-martial or face execution. His stomach dropped. They've branded me a traitor. Zara'el's eyes narrowed. What does that mean for us? If they catch me, I'm dead, he said, voice grim. We need to move fast. She placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. We'll find another way. They slipped back into the crowd, wary of prying eyes. As they navigated the market, a group of Valthorians emerged, their silver skin and glowing tattoos mirroring Zara'el's. Their leader, a towering figure with scars crisscrossing his face, stepped forward. Zara'el, he said, his voice resonant. We've tracked you across systems. Our people need warriors like you to reclaim our worlds. Zara'el stood firm, her expression unyielding. My clan is gone. I fight for myself now. You are Valthorian, the leader pressed. Your blood binds you to us. My blood binds me to him, she said, gesturing to Jackson. He's my ally, my clan. The Valthorians murmured, their eyes flicking to Jackson with disdain. A human? The leader scoffed. You betray your heritage for this? I choose my path, Zara'el said, her voice cutting like her blade. Leave us. The leader's face hardened, but he signaled his group to withdraw, their silver forms vanishing into the crowd. Jackson turned to her, awe in his eyes. You gave up your people for me. You've earned my loyalty, she said simply. That's worth more than duty. Before he could respond, a gruff voice interrupted. Jackson Thorn, you son of a gun. Jackson spun to see Marcus, his old IDF squadmate, pushing through the market. Marcus was broad-shouldered, his face weathered, but his eyes held a mix of relief and caution. "Marcus," Jackson said warily, "what brings you to Haven 9? "Looking for you," Marcus replied. "Word is you went rogue after that recon disaster." "What happened?" "Long story," Jackson said, "but I'm not going back. The IDF's lost my trust." Marcus sighed. "I get it, but you're in deep. The IDF wants you dead, and they're not the only ones. There's a bigger player involved." "What do you mean?" Jackson asked, tension creeping into his voice. Marcus leaned closer, voice dropping. "There's a higher power at work, a syndicate, maybe pulling strings across the galaxy. They want you and her gone, and I don't know why." Zara'el's hand tightened on her sword. "Who are they?" "No names," Marcus said. "Just whispers of power, credits, influence, control. They're hunting you, and they don't miss." Jackson's mind raced. "Why us?" "Maybe you're a threat," Marcus said. "Or just in their way. Either way, I can get you a ship, but you need to disappear." "We will," Jackson said. "Thanks, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet," Marcus said, his scowl deepening. "Stay sharp, or you're both dead." He melted into the crowd, leaving Jackson and Zara'el to process his warning. The neon lights of Haven 9 flickered, casting long shadows, as if the syndicate's reach extended even here. Jackson Thorn stood at the edge of Haven 9's bustling spaceport, the roar of engines and chatter of alien traders fading into a distant hum. His heart pounded as he weighed the path ahead. Beside him, Zara'el stood tall, her silver skin catching the neon glow, her black eyes steady yet warm. Their journey through Syrion's brutal desert, surviving ambushes, storms, and betrayals, had changed him. He thought of the wreckage where she first saved him, the minefield where she carried him, the storm where she found him. Each moment had woven their fates together, a bond stronger than duty or war. "Zara'el," he said, his voice firm despite the weight of his thoughts. "I've been thinking about everything we've faced. The fights, the losses, the times we thought we wouldn't make it." She turned, her gaze piercing but attentive. "And what have you decided?" "You've given me something I thought I'd lost," he admitted, his words raw. "Purpose. Not just surviving, but living for something real. You've shown me there's more than the IDF's orders, more than guilt." Zara'el's lips curved into a rare smile, softening her warrior's edge. "You've done the same for me, Jackson. My clan's gone, my purpose shattered. But with you, I found a reason to keep fighting, not just for survival, but for a future." Jackson felt a weight lift, the burden of his past, civilians he couldn't save, orders he regretted, easing in her presence. "I'm done with the IDF, with their wars. I'm staying with you, Zara'el, wherever this takes us." Her eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through. "Together, then, no matter what comes." They approached a transport ship, its hull scarred from countless voyages. The pilot, a grizzled alien with scales like polished obsidian, waved them aboard. "You two ready? We're headed to the outer rim, worlds no one's charted." Jackson paused, his hand brushing Zara'el's. Her touch grounded him, a silent promise of their shared path. "Ready," he said, stepping forward. The ship's engines roared, the vibration pulsing through the deck as they ascended. Jackson looked out a viewport, watching Haven 9 shrink below, its lights fading into the desert's darkness. A surge of liberation washed over him, his guilt replaced by a fragile but growing hope. He glanced at Zara'el, her presence a steady anchor, and knew he'd chosen right. As they settled into the cramped passenger bay, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Heard rumors of a new war brewing out there. Could get rough, but that's the drifter's life." Jackson's stomach tightened, but he met Zara'el's gaze. They shared a silent nod, their bond a shield against whatever lay ahead. Hands clasped, they faced the unknown, ready for new adventures in uncharted worlds.